Hello students, welcome back to your English literature class. In our previous video, that is of Angel in Disguise part 1, we had done about the author, story, theme and summary of the story. In today's video, we will be doing characters, title, style and critical appreciation of the same. So for that, please open your book at page number 116. Okay, so objectives of this video are that after going through this video, you will be able to learn more about the main characters of this story, know about the suitability of the title, critically appreciate the story, learning about the style as well. So students, let's begin with the character of Maggie. So Maggie is the youngest of her family and is tragically crippled. Students, please underline the word crippled and write down severely damaged. So how was she crippled? So she is crippled from falling from a window 2 years ago. She is unable to leave her bed unless carried in someone's arm, which shows that she is so much crippled that she is not able to get up from her bed on her own. So it shows that she is weak and helpless. Maggie symbolizes innocence and helplessness because she literally cannot survive without the love and care of someone else. Maggie turns out to be a blessing in the Thompson house because she gives Mrs. Thompson a purpose. She brings joy into the sad life of Thompsons. So students, Maggie is the youngest of 3 children of her mother, who dies of excessive drinking, right? And like any other human being, she cannot survive without love and care of someone else. As Mrs. Thompson was living without purpose and was very sad, but Maggie turns out to be a blessing in the Thompson house and gives her a purpose, and that is to love a child like Maggie. In fact, an angel had come into who is his here? Thompson's house. Disguised, please underline the word disguised and write down to change the appearance or guise of so as to conceal identity or mislead. So when we are disguised as someone, we basically are changing our appearance so that we can look like someone else or mislead. Okay. And just here, according to the context, disguise here means that she was an angel in the guise of a human being. Right? So, and how was she disguised? She was disguised as this angel. So, she was disguised as a sick, helpless child and filled all its dreary chambers. What do you mean by dreary? Dreary means depressingly dull chambers. So, depressingly dull rooms of her heart. So, Maggie had filled all the dull rooms of their heart with love. She talks a little but conveys her despair when she says something. After losing her family, she says, "Oh, Mr. Thompson, don't leave me here all alone." Though it is a short sentence, it has a very specific emotional coloring. Students, this short sentence shows that she was afraid of being left alone. And this very sentence is full of emotions. She is very polite and humble. She always says sir when she talks to Joe Thompson. So her addressing to Mr. Joe Thompson as sir shows that she is very polite. In fact, Maggie's character illustrates. Students, please underline the word illustrates and write down serves as an example of. So it serves as an example of the main theme of the story. And what is that theme? That humans cannot survive without other humans to love and care for them. So students, as I told you earlier as well, that each and every person on earth needs love and care, which is one of the main themes of the chapter. Okay, so students, I hope you have understood the character of Maggie very well. Now, let's move on to the character of Mrs. Thompson. So Mrs. Thompson, who happens to be childless, is not a woman of saintly temper. She is first introduced as a very cruel, harsh character with little compassion for Maggie. When her husband, Joe Thompson, enters his home with Maggie in his arms, Mrs. Thompson is enraged. Please underline the word enraged and write down angry. So Mrs. Thompson is enraged and says why he has brought that sick brat into their home. Students, Mrs. Thompson, who happens to be childless, is a woman without compassion, kindness and sympathy for anyone. She is not a woman of saintly temper, as I discussed in my first video as well. Right? So the women being childless became vinegar tempered and heartless. But after spending time with Maggie, Mrs. Thompson is transformed. Please underline the word transformed and write down make a marked change. So Mrs. Thompson is transformed and decides to take care of Maggie for a few more days, which eventually, please underline the word eventually and write down in the end, especially after a long delay. That's an alternative to its meaning. So, which eventually turns into the rest of her life. Mrs. Thompson ends up falling in love with Maggie and finds purpose in taking care and looking after her. So, after arrival of Maggie into their house, she finds something to love out of herself. All the motherly feelings which were buried within her were brought out and she started to love and care again. The Thompsons end up keeping Maggie and she becomes a blessing. It had been dark and cold and miserable. Students, please underline the word miserable and write down unhappy or uncomfortable. So it had been dark, cold and miserable there for a long time. Just because his wife had nothing to love and care for out of herself and so became sore, irritable, ill-tempered and self-afflicting. So underline the word self-afflicting and write down infliction of pain or suffering on oneself. So I had told this also in the part 1 of this video that this is the infliction of pain that is usually self-created. So in the desolation again, it is a state of complete emptiness. So since she was not having any child, so she has become desolate. Now the sweetness of that sick child has transformed her. She is no longer irritable and ill-tempered. Students, please underline the word ill-tempered and write down irritable. She is a loving and caring person. The sweetness of Maggie is like honey to her soul, and she carries her in her heart as well as in her arms. So, the sweetness of that sick child transforms her. She is a loving and caring person. The sweetness of Maggie is like honey to her soul, and she carries her in her heart as well as in her arms. So students, I hope character of Jane Thompson is quite clear to you. Now let us know about the character of Joe Thompson. So Joe Thompson, the wheelwright, is a kind-hearted person. Though rough in exterior, he has a tender heart. Students, please underline the word exterior and write down forming, situated on or relating to the outside of something. So here we are talking about his external personality. He is rough in his physical personality, outer physical personality, but he is having a tender heart, that is a soft heart. He loves to spend his time with children. He is a strong man, but the experience with Maggie touches him greatly. And that is why he cries a little bit when the youngest Maggie, the crippled child, is left alone because nobody wants to deal with her disability. So students, Joe Thompson is a kind-hearted and caring person. He likes the company of children and has a tender heart. Now what affects him greatly is when Maggie is accepted by no one due to her disability. So he takes pity on Maggie and decides to take her with him. For a while he is puzzled because he knows that his wife would not accept her. But he soon resolves, underline the word resolve and write down, settle or find a solution to. And please underline the word conflict and write down the meaning, a serious disagreement or argument. So he soon resolves his conflicts and takes her along with him. He lifts her in his strong arms and takes her to his home. So he takes pity on her and takes her home, knowing that his wife would not like it. Basically, his decision to bring Maggie home leads to all the action in the story. He has great understanding of his wife. When she asks why he has brought that sick brat to her home, he does not reply, but gives her a look that is pleading and cautionary. So students, please underline the word sick brat and write down spoiled child. And underline the word pleading and write down the action of making emotional appeal to someone. Underline the word cautionary and write down serves as a warning. So basically he didn't reply and just gave a cautionary look. So students, Joe Thompson knows his wife very well, and that is why he does not argue with his wife, rather gives her a cautionary look. Then, to calm his wife down, he refers to the Bible, in which it is mentioned that the Savior rebuked the disciples who did not receive and love the children. Please underline the word rebuked and write down expressed sharp disapproval. So Joe Thompson confronts his vinegar-tempered wife, Jane Thompson, after he lays Maggie on the bed and comes out. So he exhorts his wife to be kind to her. Exhorts, strongly urge, that is strongly requests. So he exhorts his wife to be kind to her and treats her gently. The voice of the strong, rough man shakes and he turns his head away to hide his moist eyes. His words have the desired effect and a soft feeling creeps into his wife's heart. Underline the word creeps and write down moved slowly. So he saw anger and astonishment in the tone of Jane Thompson. Her face was actually in flames. And here, according to Joe Thompson, the Bible says that Bible never teaches to hate the person. Moreover, if anyone loves the children, Jesus will bring happiness in their life as well. And the ones who do not love them, Jesus rebuke them. So students, I hope you have understood the character of Mr. Joe Thompson as well. Now, let us see the title, if its suitability is there or not. The title of the story, An Angel in Disguise, is most appropriate because the story deals with Maggie, the youngest of her family, who proves to be an angel in disguise for the Thompsons. A poor woman falls upon the threshold of her own door in a drunken fit and dies, leaving behind 2 daughters and a son to fend for themselves. So students, as I had told you earlier as well, that Maggie is crippled and no one wants to deal with her disability. You can say that Joe Thompson finally comes into rescue and takes Maggie home. So the 2 oldest children, John and Katie, are taken away by new families. But the youngest, Maggie, who is crippled, is left alone because no one wants to deal with her disability. Joe Thompson, a kind-hearted person, takes Maggie to his home. His wife, Mrs. Thompson, is enraged to find that he has brought that sick brat to her home. Joe Thompson exhorts his wife to be kind to her and treat her gently. But Mrs. Thompson, who happens to be childless, is an irritable, ill-tempered woman. So, Mr. Joe Thompson finally comes in to rescue and takes Maggie home. She spends a day with Maggie. Who is she here? She here is Mrs. Thompson. So she spends a day with Maggie. Gradually, underline the word gradually and write down the meaning slowly. So gradually she grows fond of her and begins to love Maggie. The sweetness of Maggie, the sick and helpless child, looking ever to her in love, patience and gratitude, is like honey to her soul. Students, please underline the word gratitude and write down the quality of being helpful. And she carries her in her heart as well as in her arms, a precious burden. Maggie proves to be an angel in disguise to Mrs. Thompson. Thus, the title is most suitable. So, students, as Mrs. Thompson had no one to take care of or to love, that is why she became so irritable and ill-tempered. Now, the sweetness of that sick child who was thirsty for love is honey to her soul as she carries her in her heart as well as arms. Maggie comes as an angel in disguise and fills their dreary chambers with love, and proved to be angel in disguise, and hence the title is suitable. The story is set in a village where a poor woman who was hated during her life by nearly everyone in her village dies, while intoxicated, and leaves 2 daughters and a son behind to fend for themselves. Students, please underline the word intoxicated and write down drunk or under the influence of drugs. So she dies while intoxicated. And underline the word to fend and write down look after. So she leaves behind 2 daughters and 1 son to look after for themselves. The village people pity these children, and the 2 oldest are taken away by new families. So students, first of all, here we come to know that basically the setting of the story is in a village. Right, there is no proper description of the place, but we could imagine that the setting is in a village. Right, which is dark and gloomy. Okay. But the youngest Maggie, who is crippled, is left alone because nobody wants to deal with her disability. The scene shifts to Joe Thompson's house when he takes Maggie with him to his house. When Joe brings Maggie home in his arms, his wife, Mrs. Thompson, is enraged. Enraged means angry that he has brought that sick brat in her home. So students, again, as I told you earlier, so since Mr. Joe Thompson has brought Maggie in his arms, his wife, Mrs. Thompson, is really angry. But soon the sweetness of that sick child, looking ever to her in love, patience and gratitude, is like honey to her soul, and he carries her in her heart as well as in her arms, a precious burden. Maggie stays in his house forever, and Maggie becomes a blessing for the Thompsons. She is an angel in disguise. So students, let's move on to the style of this story. So the story is written in a traditional style. The narrator in the third person controls whole narrative. He acts as a commentator and a controller, as the purpose of the story is didactic. Please underline the word didactic and write down intended to teach. So here the writer is intended to teach us few moral lessons. He refers to the Bible to reinforce his idea. Underline the word reinforce and write down support. The language used is simple and straightforward. There is a variety of sentences to make the narration interesting. Though the language is mostly denotative. Denotative, underline the word and write down the meaning, denoting the main meaning and doesn't include feelings. So basically the language was straightforward. It doesn't include any feeling, but then also the writer uses certain figure of speech which lend charm to the story. So basically the simple, didactic and denotative style of writing adds charm to the story. For instance, death is personified. Please underline the word personified and write down the meaning. Represent a quality or concept by a figure in human form. So here in this chapter, death is given human quality and that is how it is personified. So Maggie is described as a precious burden, which is a beautiful use of the oxymoron. Students, what is this oxymoron? Oxymoron is a figure of speech in which contradictory terms are used together. For example, faith, unfaithful, or forlorn group. So forlorn group is an oxymoron. Why? Because forlorn means alone and group cannot be alone. So here also in this story, oxymoron is used where he's saying a precious burden. Like the thing which is precious can't be a burden. Okay. So the biblical allusion, please underline the word allusion and write down the meaning. An expression designed to call something to mind with an indirect reference. So basically he wants to convey something else, but here the writer conveys it indirectly as an allusion where he is giving the example from Bible. So the biblical allusion to Jesus called the Savior is significant. So here when he was giving the example of Jesus in the Bible, he used the word the Savior. So by alluding is a verb form of allusion. So by alluding to Jesus and his teachings, the husband in the story is able to convince his wife about necessity to be kind, generous and helpful. So students, Mr. Joe was saying all these to his wife so that she should be kind to her, and his words actually had an impact on her. So the story moves from one point to another smoothly and ends on a note of hope. As the story opens with a sad note, but gradually it gears up into a happy one. So students, let's move on to critical appreciation. Third person narrative. The story is narrated in the third person by an omniscient narrator. Omniscient, who knows everything. So here we don't know the narrator, but what we know is that the narrator is omniscient and he knows everything. So the author introduces us some characters by direct characterization. For example, he comments on the drunken woman directly. And moreover, when he tells the readers about the drunken woman and her children, he is both in agony for the children and angry at the woman for her not so admirable life that she led. Right? So the woman had been despised, underline the word despised and write down to regard with distaste. Underline the word scoffed at and write down speak to someone about something in a mocking way, that is in a teasing way, right? And angrily denounced. Angrily denounced means to criticize someone strongly. So the woman had been despised, scoffed at and angrily denounced by nearly every man, woman and child in the village. So students, first of all, underline the word bias and write down a strong inclination of the mind which may be favorable or unfavorable. So where we just have a strong inclination towards one point of view, right? And then underline predicament. Predicament means a state of being in an embarrassing situation. Now underline the word orphan and write down a child whose parents are dead, right? So next is reluctant, which means unwilling. Now coming up to the text, the narrator has a bias towards the children of a dead woman, especially Maggie, due to her predicament of being an orphan, whom everyone is reluctant to take in. The narrator demonstrates this bias when he describes Maggie as having sad eyes and patient face. So students, the narrator demonstrates his tender feelings for Maggie when he described her as a soul having sad eyes and patient face. So students, let us do the purpose behind writing of the story. So the author wrote the story in order to illustrate the importance of caring and loving. Not only does Maggie need the care and love of another to survive, but Mrs. Thompson also needs Maggie as someone to care and love for, to live a happy and purposeful life. So students, the main purpose of writing the story is that writer wants to prove that a truly meaningful life is made up of a series of daily acts of kindness. Not only Maggie needs care and attention, but Mrs. Thompson also needs the same in return. So this displays that humans are interdependent and cannot live in isolation. So underline the word isolation and write down the state of being in a place or a situation that is separate from others. So this situation that the writer has created shows us that a human cannot live in isolation. The author proves that love is essential for human survival. So students, I hope you have understood the purpose behind the story. Now let us do the tone. So the tone of the story is a melancholy. Please underline the word melancholy and write down a feeling of sadness. So the tone of story is melancholy one. A woman whom none cared about previously has passed away, and the townspeople suddenly act as if they are in mourning. Underline the word mourning and write down the expression of sorrow for someone's death. So the villagers are showing that they are mourning, they are really very sad. This tone continues as the narrator reveals that the children are orphans, and especially when none of the townspeople is willing to take little Maggie in. So please underline the word reveals and disclose. So once Joe Thompson takes Maggie to his house, the tone shifts from melancholy to hope. Finally, when Mrs. Thompson realizes that Maggie is bringing the couple happiness, the tone ultimately shifts to loving and optimistic for the future. So students, first of all, why the tone of the story is in melancholy? As the writer shows sadness on the destiny of the three children, right? And the writer has shown the different variations in the tone, such as melancholy, mourning, hope, love, and optimism. So what's the message given in the story? The story gives a message to alcoholics and those who discriminate against disabled person. Underline the word discriminate and write down differentiate. The story gives a message to alcoholics and the ones who differentiate between disabled people and abled ones. So it reflects the tragedy that alcohol can inflict. Underline the word inflict and write down cause something unpleasant. So it reflects the tragedy that alcohol can inflict on a family. It also targets those who have a bias against the disabled because it illustrates the joy and love that disabled people can bring to one's life. Underline the word illustrates and write down serves as an example. So this story serves as an example for the ones who actually differentiate. So students, here the writer seems to target the alcoholics and those who discriminate against handicapped or disabled person. So coming up to the language, the writer uses carefully planned complex sentences with powerful vocabulary in order to lay emphasis. Underline the word emphasis and write down special importance on the importance of loving and caring for others. He makes use of literary devices to make his style rich, literary and artistic. He makes use of personification in the following line. Death touches the spring of our common humanity. So students, here the death is personified. That is, it touches the spring of a common humanity. Then he uses oxymoron, precious burden in the line. She carried her in her heart as well as in her arms, a precious burden. So students, as I had told you earlier also, oxymoron is a literary device that is used when two contradictory terms are used. So here, a precious burden is a contradictory term, as the thing which is precious cannot be burden. So students, I hope you have understood the content in today's video. Students, please, for your homework, revise the character of Mr. Joe Thompson, Maggie and Mrs. Jane Thompson. Thank you so much.